Hello and welcome to Label Sessions Presents, the podcast where we talk to the most interesting people about all the things you need to know in the worlds of innovation, business, design, tech, and culture. I am Fuzlin Esau, and today we're joined by two brand new additions to the Label Sessions expert roster, as well as Josh Nixon from the Label Sessions team. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
So hello and welcome to Charlotte Dewhurst, the brand builder who leads with curiosity. Charlotte brings clarity to chaos, helping brands, teams, and leaders cut through noise, reset, and move with purpose. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. And also a big welcome to Mai Fenton, the CMO who turns marketing into a growth engine. Mai brings structure, insight, and commercial edge to marketing teams, repositioning brands, and unlocking momentum where it matters most. Welcome to both of you.
Hi. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here.
The Rugby World Cup is live right now, the Women's Rugby World Cup. I have to give a shout out to the South African team, obviously, in terms of how great they're doing. Beautiful things happening there. But the question is, can women's sport become big business? We're seeing it more and more on our screens and in our feeds. What should leaders be doing to move women's sport in a more sort of commercial direction?
It's a difficult one in terms of the scale versus men's sports, obviously, because the audience, I believe, is naturally smaller in terms of women's doing sports. So we know that, for example, the proportion of girls that are active and are engaged in sport is much lower than boys, even if, the gap is narrowing with the, what's the Sport England campaign? Yeah,
This girl can.
This girl can, yeah. So, thank you. So yeah, it's narrowing, but obviously there's a smaller pool there, which is the first battle to overcome. So in the long term, if I'm thinking very long term, I think there's probably a role to play in sort of tackling that and making sure that sport activity is not dropped at about teenage years, which I think is when it happens with girls. The reason I know this is because I'm engaged with a charity which supports young people back into education through the power of rugby, interestingly, the Lanya Rugby work. So I'm a trustee, I'm on the board. And so, we know that it's a real challenge for girls. So I think that's the start, the first hurdle. But I think there's still a potential for women's sports to become a huge commercial opportunity. And we've seen that in the US. I think women's football is very successful, I believe. I'm not so sure why, but it's particularly it's stronger than men's football, soccer, in America. So there is the opportunity, and I think what the article that you shared with the approach from World Rugby does make sense, I think, and tapping into the power of personalities. I think for the sport to be successful, you need obviously an audience, you need viewership. And for me, that means male viewership and female viewership. So understand what each different audience wants from women's sport is very important, because I think if I think about football, for example, for a man might be very different, how they consume the sport as well. He's down the pub, he's with mates, or he's at home, and same for women. What is the appeal of that particular sport? How would they consume it? Why would they engage with it? Especially in between sort of big tournaments, getting that insight would be very important to shape the product experience of that particular sport. I think I was thinking about the 100, the cricket tournament, when I was reflecting on topic, because I got involved through a piece of co-branded content around it. And the 100 was it 5 years ago, was launched as a completely new format by the England Cricket Board, because cricket is normally like run over a number of days. You need a huge amount of time. You might find it not particularly exciting and engaging because it lasts forever. And they did some research, and they wanted to attract more families and women, and girls into the sport. And they launched that very short, the new tournament, completely innovative. Each match is a couple of hours. And the latest data shows that they have significantly grown their share of families, but especially women, viewership and engagement. And I think that's very smart. Right? Again, it all starts from really understanding who you're trying to attract. And how to really resonate with them. They took a very drastic approach. They launched a completely new format and competition. I'm not saying, every sport needs to do that, but it all comes back from understanding what are your audience's expectation, and build a strong plan from it.
I agree, and I guess just to build on that, I think, women's sport is thriving, but despite itself, and I think, we're in a society that is not particularly conducive to supporting women's sport. And so I get really excited when I start to think about the opportunity, because, not just as brands and as people who can support from that side, which is equally, a privilege and a right and a responsibility that we need to think about, but just as a society, if we can lean into this could be transformative for our women. I've got a daughter who's 3, and I was talking to my husband about this, and we were both saying it really feels like it would be a viable career route for her now to go into sport at a professional level. And it probably didn't feel like that when
Mm.
when I was growing up. And so I think it's sad when we look at some of the ways that we could, go so much further in this area. And I think there's some opportunity. For example, looking at some stats um over the past few days, 64% of girls drop out of sport at school at the age of 16, a bit like Mai said. And one of the main reasons that they're giving is that the clothes that they're wearing are not feeling comfortable and secure. And I think, wow, like if I'm sitting there in a clothing brand, and I'm not saying the research and development isn't happening. I know there's a number of clothing brands
Mm.
leaning into this, but what an opportunity. Like if we could really nail some great sportswear that, younger people felt great about wearing and fitted their bodies and fitted their identities, then what an impact we can make.
Mhm.
And I think, it really speaks to kind of the broader trend of like, we are women thriving in a world that is often not designed for women, whether that's a car seat, whether that's our iPhone that doesn't quite fit in our hands. All of those things are really markers of what we as society should be thinking about when it comes to women in sport. And then when I think about us in the kind of, or certainly me in the advertising, marketing, branding industry, you look at it from that side of things. And I've asked myself the question, I have been responsible for marketing budgets, of which sponsorship has been a part.
Mm.
Why haven't I thought about sponsoring women's sport? And, honestly, I don't know the answer to that, apart from it hasn't been on the media agenda high enough. Only 3% of TV ad spend is spent on women's sports. That's inexcusable. And, I bring myself into that as somebody who's culpable for that stat. So I think there's a real kind of shift in momentum about getting real. And my previous media agency, when I was at Matalan, shared a great example of, I think, just even from an employee culture perspective, bringing women's sport to the fore. So when the men were playing last year in the football tournament, and they were in the semis and they were, perhaps going to win, there was a massive company-wide agreement that they would get the day off if the men won. Of course they didn't, so they didn't get the day off. But when the women won the Euros earlier in the year, the business said, yeah, absolutely, we're going to give everybody the day off. And I think, again, that's walking the walk and talking the talk. And it sounds simple, but we've all got a part to play in this, so that it doesn't become the less trodden path. It just becomes the norm. And that, for me, as the mum of a 3-year-old, is super exciting.
I love that. And that really kind of shows that the way to actually get it to be commercial is to invest in it, like to actually invest
Absolutely.
invest in sort of grassroots programs, invest in the ad dollars, just making sure that we are investing, or else the commercial aspects aren't really ever going to fully come to its
Mhm.
potential.
Yeah, and I think women's sports. You were mentioning sponsorship, Charlotte. So it's not giving you the eyeballs that men's sport does, and your media agency were probably thinking about this kind of metrics, but in a way, it also has with the positioning of your brand, right? In terms of be more progressive, supporting equality, that kind of stuff. So there's values in that, and perhaps it's a less competitive space from a sponsorship point of view as well. So, you know, maybe less eyeballs, but more engaged, more visibility. You know, there's certainly some considerations, I think, as a brand that you should be having beyond just the regular sort of media effectiveness metrics. If should you, you know, consider sponsorships. And I really admire brands that have gone that way, you know, at all levels. I was talking to the CEO of a business who's sponsoring the Bristol Bears and one of their new signed up players, the rugby team. And, you know what, amazing, because he's in an industry that is finance very male dominated. It's like, you know what, actually, I'm going to go against the flow. I'm going to sponsor, you know, in the women's space. And I think it's from sort of start embracing what you stand for as a company. You know, your it can go a long way as well if you leverage the property in the right way.
I also think we're seeing that investment in players as salaries sort of become closer together. It's almost the sort of catalyst to like, okay, this is important now. You know, and this was the US women's soccer team, which were doing really well. They were outperforming the male team, you know, leaps and bounds, and they were getting all of the eyeballs, but they weren't getting any of the sort of revenue share. They weren't getting the big salaries. They weren't getting all those. And the minute that switch kind of happened, it became now legitimized. So suddenly it became that, you know, for little girls in the US, it's completely viable now to be a soccer star. And that's pretty amazing that they've managed to do that over the last few years, because
there's a future for your daughter, Charlotte. A bright future.
It is, and that's exciting. I think for me, it's been a really great, thought-provoking few days thinking about this topic, because what stands out for me is, like, we all have to stop paying lip service to women's sport. We all can sit here, as I do, and say, this is, you know, this is a cultural revolution. We're on the cusp of something that's going to be really different, but, you know, we need to make different choices, and we need to be really vocal about that. So that's certainly where I stand on it.